Okay, I'll take things up from where we finished last time. Plutarch's denial that Homer's Nepenthe is a material substance, a pharmakon, can be situated within a long history of regarding psychotropic medications as something negative, something suspicious, something to be avoided. We might want to contend that such an attitude has undergone a shift in recent decades, in part due to the scale of the use of these medications, that they've experienced something of a destigmatization in comparison with, say, the decades preceding and following the revolution in psychotropics of the 1950s, although this is contingent in part on the class of medication, i.e. antipsychotics are still antipsychotics. But it's certainly the case that, and this is true regardless of the medication type, anxiety and unease about psychotropics persists. Yes. The attitude Plutarch displays to Nepenthe wasn't, as we touched on last time, necessarily typical in the Greco-Roman world. And I raised the question of how Plutarch's position might be related to his Platonism. And yes, a suspicion of medications in general, not just psychotropics, is something we can trace back to Plato, along with, from a somewhat different perspective, the authors of the Hippocratic corpus, with the latter's advocacy of vis medicatrix naturae and the use of regimen to support this, producing a typically cautious and conservative attitude to medication. In sections 88 and 89 of the Timaeus, Plato will discuss the best type of movement for treating parts of the body. The relation between movement and health and illness was accorded significant importance by numerous authors in the ancient world. As he will state, where means of purging and restoring, the term Plato uses is katharseon, the genitive plural of catharsis, where means of purging and restoring the body are concerned, the best is exercise, the second best is being rocked on a boat or some other vehicle that isn't an exhausting ride. The third, however, should be a last resort in dire emergencies, or what could be translated as should only be used as an absolute necessity, and never otherwise accepted by a man of intelligence. This is the medical use of drugs, pharmakeutikos, to purge the body. A statement he immediately follows by warning, the point is that, except in cases of grave danger, diseases should not be exacerbated by the use of drugs, adding that, for in its structure, every disease resembles in some sort the nature of the living creature, so that whenever anyone does violence to the structure of a disease by the use of drugs before it has run its course, this is only likely to result in problems increasing in both severity and number. Plato's caution here against the use of pharmakon as leading to the worsening of an illness and introducing further difficulties for the patient returns us to the double status of pharmakon, as signifying both medicine and poison, and the potentially negative effects of the use of pharmakon in medical treatment that we looked at in some detail in the second of these videos. But as we can see, Plato also draws attention to the violence. For theire, medications present two systasis noson, a disease's structure or composition, noting how this structure resembles the living creature, i.e. the sufferer, the patient, in regards to which he highlights the dimension of time, and the notion that just as an individual creature is allotted a predetermined period of existence, so are diseases, and that trying to eliminate a disease before its time is likely to only result in problems increasing. And yet, in terms of the affinity between a disease, a pathology, and the nature of the living creature, we can certainly look beyond this temporal dimension. The idea that psychopathologies are far from simply pathological constitutes a tenet of psychoanalysis, as we encounter at one level in the symptom, and the terms in which it serves to crystallize the singularity of the subject's relation to the real and to their truth. It's in seminar 23 we find Lacan designating the symptom as constituting a fourth ring added to the Borromean knot that serves as a means of binding the real, symbolic and imaginary for the subject. And as we know, Freud will emphasize the status of seemingly pathological psychotic phenomena as constituting attempts at restitution as reparative, of which delusions present perhaps the best known, but by no means only instance. In regard to the latter, see, for example, the loss of reality in neurosis and psychosis, and the paper on the unconscious. As he'll famously state in discussing Schreber's autobiography, the delusional formation, which we take to be the pathological product, is in reality an attempt at recovery, a process of reconstruction. Medications in their capacity, as Plato warns, to do violence to the structure of a disease, threaten to disrupt or overturn the value function of these mechanisms. Here we can include medication's capacity to bring about a reduction in symptoms, which is what they aim at doing, that can serve, if not to completely annul, then obscure or cover over the subject's relation to their symptoms, and what this might reveal of the subject's truth. And as we know, in the case of antipsychotics, we can witness, in part at least as a result of their numbing, tranquilizing effects, the effacing, the denuding of psychotic phenomena, from ideas to practices that serve to support the subject to function in the world. So that we can ask, in the case of the 40-year-old man discussed by Van Putin et al. In Drug Refusal in Schizophrenia and the Wish to be Crazy that I referenced in an earlier video, whether the grandiose ideas he possessed of himself as being a composer, having billions and being the world's greatest aeronautical engineer, might well have served as a means of accessing and sustaining a subjective position that allowed him not just to engage with life, but possessed a vivifying function as well. As the authors note on readmission, his mood conveyed excitement. But how back on flufenazine he was, as they put it, objectively globally improved. Mainly, it seems, in the sense that his grandiose delusions receded and became invested with less emotional force. And yet, as the authors note, subjectively he seemed to resent the increased reality contact, leading to him leaving the hospital and discontinuing treatment. With psychotropic medications today, a key focus of concern is the effects they might have in altering the subject, that the subject won't be who they are or were, something that healthcare providers and prescribers have been keen to counter and reassure against. So you can read statements like, psychotropic medications aren't about changing you, they're about helping you become more you. Or one of the biggest myths about psychiatric medication is that it alters your personality, and that mental health conditions can distort your thinking, drain energy, and impact your behaviour. Medication can help alleviate these symptoms, allowing your true self to come through more clearly. In response to which one could reply by making the perhaps rather obvious point that, considering the vast amounts of time and money people expend trying to change who they are, there's something at least somewhat paradoxical about this. Indeed, the question who wants to be who they are, or indeed what they are, is one that, however naive sounding it might seem, reaches, of course, to the heart of the analytic endeavour, up to and including the end of analysis. What's clearly at play here in the statements I've just quoted is a notion of a real me, a true me, or true self that medication threatens to change, to alter, to corrupt. Something we find mirrored from a psychoanalytic standpoint in terms of the potential threat medication is conceived as presenting to the subject's relation to their truth. As I've highlighted previously in this series, medication can alter the subject's relation to the symbolic and to the other, as in the example I gave last time of medication altering a subject's relation to their speech. Is it right, though, to think that medication can alter the subject's relation to their truth, and if so, in what terms? I've already pointed to how medication can bring about a reduction in the prevalence and intensity of a subject's symptoms, as well as their broader experience of jouissance, both of which might be taken as indicative of, as indexing a shift in the subject's relation to their truth. In terms of the structure and content of this truth, though, it's harder to see how this is the case. A subject will remain, divided or not. Their objet prettier will remain their objet prettier. Their fantasy or fantasies may reduce in intensity, but in terms of their content, there's nothing to suggest this is likely to alter palpably. As such, we could say that while a subject's proximity to their truth may have receded or become more opaque or veiled, their truth will not in itself, in terms of its content or structure, have fundamentally altered. And yet it's clear that the sense of medications altering the subject's experience of who they are and how phenomenologically, if you like, they experience the world constitutes a significant source of concern vis-à-vis medications. In regard to which, we can turn again to the notion of the double, that, as I've suggested previously, is always there in some form in the experience of taking medication. Indeed, as I pointed to then, the emergence of this double and the sense of not being who they were that it generates can be enough to bring a subject to stop taking a medication even when its benefits are acknowledged. This sense of medication threatening the truth of the subject and or giving rise to the production of this double is something we can understand as deriving from two of medication's fundamental attributes. One, medication's potency, its power or potential power. That I invoked previously when I spoke of medications producing effects and possessing a power akin to the gods. We will be returning to this. But two, before these effects can come about, a medication that is ab extra, that comes from outside, that's external to the subject, has to be taken in, to be ingested or incorporated by the subject. This is, of course, absolutely fundamental. While the majority of psychotropics are taken orally, other methods of administration can also be used, and yet in each case we find the same ab extra dynamic at play. In so doing, we can say that medications introduce an element from the real, an additional element from the real, that exists beyond, outside of the subject, into the subject, what I referred to last time as a plus R element. And it's precisely by introducing a foreign element that wasn't part of the subject into the subject from which the idea of the subject's corruption, or dare I say pollution, can be seen to derive. This thing that isn't me, that isn't of me, is now in me and has changed me. Somewhat embarrassingly, in the previous video, I made the error of taking pharmakoi as the plural of pharmakon, when this plural should be pharmaca. Pharmakoi is actually the plural of pharmakos, scapegoat, the subject who is charged with taking on a polis's miasma, pollution, and undergoes exile to purge the polis of this. And yes, in one respect we can trace a direct parallel in the capacity of pharmakon to purge, to remove disease from the body. But we can also see that there's another side to this, as befits pharmakon's double status, signifying both medication and poison, that of introducing a pollutant into the body. And yet, while in the case of medication, the subject's incorporation of a physical object, an element of the hard real, if you like, we can call it that, is quite obviously crucial here. There is more going on in the process of taking medication than simply this. Namely, we can see that this plus R element, this hard real object, is one that's surrounded, that's hedged around with a penumbra of distinctly non-physical elements, including potentially the subject's transference to the medication, to the prescriber, to the healthcare provider, to drug companies, to the discourse around psychotropic medication, along with whatever identifications may be at play in this mesh of transferences. Viewed in these terms, medication is far from simply being a material substance, and the taking of medication simply the ingesting, the incorporation of this substance. Rather, when someone takes medication, we should envisage them taking something like this. To spell it out, in taking medication, you're not just swallowing the plus R pill, but this penumbra as well, one consequence of which is to render the identifying and isolating of the effects of the real, the hard real, of a medication as far from straightforward, far from clear-cut, something that only serves to problematize any simplified notion of treating the real with the real, and with this biological psychiatry's fantasy of the patient as a real without a subject. And it's on the basis of dispensing with the hard real of a medication, apart, that is, from a more or less empty Potemkin pill, while allowing for the possible effects of this penumbra, that placebos, as used in clinical trials, operate. I say more or less because what are called active as opposed to inert placebos are designed to produce certain effects, certain side effects associated with the medication type, such as a dry mouth or dizziness, with the intention of rendering less obvious their placebo status. As I'm suggesting, the idea of medications as entering into the subject from outside is something we can position as crucial to the unease surrounding them. The subject is always taking things in, though. Speech, sounds, sights, smells, food, fingers, penises, and so on, all of which index the terms of the subject's openness to the other, the subject's fundamental porousness, we could say, in the face of the other, without which the subject would not be a subject, and which we only find contested with any seriousness, i.e. structurally, in autism, and less successfully in catatonia, catatonic schizophrenia. And yet, it's clearly not the case that everything taken in, everything incorporated by the subject, is regarded as giving rise to the same unease in regard to its effects on the subject's relation to their truth as medications. So that, if we turn to drug use, so-called recreational drug use, what we encounter almost across the board, I think we can say, are experiences typically recounted as entailing a loss of self. And yet this is something that is, as we know, typically sought by the subject, rather than being positioned as something they're suspicious or wary of, and sought despite, in the face of, the criminalisation of these substances. What perhaps is particularly telling here, though, is the fact that so many of these drugs were, and in certain instances still are, used as psychotropic medications. Cocaine, ketamine, opium, amphetamine, MDMA. The list goes on. All of which serves to emphasise the role played by the contextual dimension in which a substance is taken as crucial in establishing a substance's status as threatening or not to the subject's truth. We'll be returning to this. And yet, if we turn to another potent psychoactive, the popular fast-acting, broad-spectrum anxiolytic, mood enhancer and disinhibitor, alcohol, we encounter another, a different conception of this plus R element's effect on the subject's relation to their truth, that of in vino veritas, a notion that outside of the Muslim world, and this is quite striking, we can find in cultures across the globe. From the Icelandic öl innri matur, ale reveals the inner man, to the Mandarin after wine blurts truthful speech, to the particularly intriguing Mwambi proverb found in the Bantu language Chichewa. Brew beer and you will hear what killed your mother. In the West, the origins of this notion can be traced back to a fragment or fragments from the 7th to 6th century BC lyric poet and heavy drinker Alcaeus of Lesbos, for whom references to wine were, it's fair to say, a prominent feature of his work, and from which two fragments in particular are worth noting. Fragment 366, wine, dear boy, and truth go hand in hand, which is perhaps closest to in vino veritas, and fragment 333, oinos gar anthropo dioptron, sometimes translated as wine window into a man, or perhaps more literally wine means of seeing through a man. Dioptron denotes something to look through or an optical instrument. This notion of alcohol as serving to reveal the truth is by no means uncontested in Kevin MacDonald's documentary High and Low, John Galliano, on Galliano's career and the controversy around the anti-Semitic comments he made in 2010. There's a brief interview with the addiction psychiatrist Philippe Patel, who is dismissive of in vino veritas, contending what's more applicable is in vino degueulasse. By that I mean Patel states that you can really say anything when you are no longer controlling what you are saying. Knowing what we know, we might well though want to ask in what sense we should think of degueulasse, in vino degueulasse, as simply replacing or cancelling out veritas, As we know, this truth, a subject's truth, might very well resonate with a sense of degueulasse. It's certainly not a case of either or. The idea that the truth, a subject's truth, can be revealed through the taking of a substance, a plus R substance, has been a powerful one, extending beyond alcohol, as we see in the case of the so-called truth serums of the 20th century. The best known perhaps being scopolamine, pentothal and amobarbital. Alice Winter, in her 2005 paper The Making of Truth Serum, traces the attempt in the United States in the 1920s to establish scopolamine as a forensic tool. Scopolamine is a substance found in mandrake and used as an amnestic in pain relief. And it was after witnessing scopolamine's effects in its latter role that the Texas physician Robert House would promote its use as a truth serum. It's to him we owe the term for use in forensic contexts, with House arguing that on scopolamine it was impossible for drugged individuals to lie because they possessed no power to think or reason. This was because on scopolamine the conscious mind is asleep while the subconscious mind will function by stimulation of the centre of hearing. And yes, it's possible to trace the influence of analytic ideas here on the idea of the subconscious mind as the seat of the truth. After trials, as in tests, not legal trials, scopolamine's forensic use was rejected, in part due, yes, to doubts about its efficacy, but also, including by those who supported its potential efficacy, a distaste for its use, with it being compared to the use of torture to extract confessions, an attitude that presents a rather different angle on the unease surrounding the relation between medication and subject's relation to the truth. As you're no doubt aware, in Lacanian terms, a truth serum can't overcome the structural impossibility of the truth being able to be fully spoken and not at most half said. Indeed, we could say that the very notion of a truth serum only serves to underscore this impossibility by highlighting the fact that no matter what's done, what's administered to the subject, whatever interventions are made at the level of the real, the truth won't be fully spoken because it can't be. The conception of what constitutes a psychoactive substance extends beyond medication, drugs, alcohol and truth serums, though, with the recent attention accorded to what's sometimes referred to as the gut-brain axis, and the field of what's most broadly termed nutritional psychiatry, emphasising the significance afforded to the psychoactive dimension of another plus R element, food, in regard to which we can look back to the origins of Western medicine, where we find nutrition and dietary management accorded a primary role in medical treatment, including in treating nosos psyches. So that we can encounter the author of the early Hippocratic treatise, Places in Man, stating, all things that cause change in the present state of the patient are drugs, and all substances that are rather strong cause change. It is possible, if you want, to bring about change by means of a drug, or, if you do not want to use a drug, by means of foods. The somewhat confusing classificatory logic at play here can be read as indicative of a situation in which the dividing line between food and pharmakon is unclear. Paradigm example of this is oinos, wine, which was widely deployed in medical treatment and more widely still enjoyed as an everyday beverage. And what we see taking place in subsequent humoral theory, actually a body of thought that would unfold and develop over many centuries, is the relation between diet and the production of humours being held up to detailed scrutiny, including in regard to the treatment of psychic suffering. So that in Galenus's De Alimentorum Facultatibus, or On the Properties or Power of Foods, likely written in the 180s, 190s, we find a detailed discussion of the quantities and mixtures of foods to be ingested to restore and maintain humoral balance. The ideal proportion of humours being defined as 1/4 as much phlegm as blood, 1/16 as much choler as blood, and 1/64 as much melancholy as blood. Clearly, the balance being sought here is quite precise, with the careful administration of diet varying in regard to the individual subject's temperament, being used as the primary means to achieve this. As I've just alluded to, we're now witnessing a burgeoning interest or re-interest in nutrition and mental health, in nutritional psychiatry and its subfields, including psychobiotics and metabolic psychiatry. To take an example of the latter, the use of the keto diet in the treatment of manic depression, which isn't without its successes, in regard to which, beyond its nutritional dimension, the prohibitions and regulations such a diet imposes shouldn't be ignored. To take things a stage further, though, the question of the psychoactive effects of nutrition foregrounds a fundamental point: that the subject's very existence is reliant upon this plus R, that without a relationship to this plus R, there can be no subject, and as such no relation to the truth. I'm talking about starvation or dehydration, about death. Is this reliance something we, at points at least, find directly or explicitly tested and contested in anorexia, where we encounter the subject seeking to try to test out what it means to exist without a reliance, or with only a minimal one, on this plus R element? Indeed, to what degree can we equate the impurity, it's not unusual to find the anorexic attributing to food, that can often assume a moral guise? Catherine of Siena presents something of an exemplar here, with food's status as a plus R element that enters from the outside into the subject. And as such, to what extent can we trace a parallel here with the corruption of the subject's truth we find associated with medications? Maybe. But beyond this, anorexia points us in the direction of another dimension of the subject's relation to plus R that we can identify as crucial in making sense of the unease about psychotropic medications, namely the role and status of the one who tells you to eat or to swallow or take the medication to incorporate the plus R. We're talking about the patient's, the subject's relation to the position and status of the prescriber, the administrator of medication. X here designates this position in regards to which I'm going to point in what might be somewhat broad terms to two forms this X can take. In one respect, we could conceive of the prescriber as coming to move into, to take up the position of the other, the big other for the subject. Conceived of in these terms, we find the prescriber as other, assuming a position of authority, or we could say dominance, over the subject. The patient subject is the recipient of, the one who receives the other's instructions, who is prescribed, taken, told, ordered to take a medication, how much to take and when to take it. We have here a situation that, at one level at least, we can see as underpinned by and restaging the first other, the mother's position vis-a-vis the child, of the child's subjugation or subordination. Let's remember Lacan will speak on more than one occasion of the mother's position of omnipotence vis-a-vis the child. But alongside this, concomitantly, we're reminded here there are dimensions, layers to the other, and if the mother constitutes its core, this other, the prescriber as other, will be formed as well from the subject's transference to the individual prescriber, the particular doctor or psychiatrist who prescribes the medication, appearing in the guise of a little other, but always overshadowed, overdetermined by the big other. In addition, at the same time, we can see how this big other will potentially be constituted from the subject's transference to the healthcare provider, pharmaceutical companies, and the discourse around medication, including perhaps the class of or specific medications prescribed, namely that penumbra I outlined above that surrounds the hard real of medication as physical substance. What are the implications of this? We should be careful not to overgeneralize here. This can vary from subject to subject, of course, but what we can say is that in conceiving of the prescriber as coming to take up the position of the other, room is opened up, at the very least, for the question of the desire of the other, que voir, to be raised for the subject, namely the question of the prescriber's desire, the question of their motivation in prescribing a medication. A question that might take a number of forms, but which will circle around, why do you want me to take this? Subjects' relation to this question will again vary, but what we find here is the opening up, at least, of the space for anxiety, and indeed more to emerge in response to this question. While we shouldn't want to be too restrictive diagnostically about this, can we say this is or can be particularly the case, or takes on a particular intensity for those for whom the paternal function hasn't come to mediate the subject's relation to the question of the desire of the other. We know that compliance rates, the term is itself suggestive of the other's position of dominance, we know that compliance rates for taking psychotropic medications in general are identified as constituting a significant obstacle in treatment, and that these rates are significantly lower for psychotropics than medications for physical illness, with rates for antipsychotics lower than for other classes of psychotropics. I'm certainly not, let me be crystal clear, suggesting that this is simply down to the patient's relation to the prescriber as other and the question of the desire of the other, and has nothing to do with the broader effects of antipsychotics. Again, this very designation, antipsychotic, could almost be seen as designed to encourage anxiety and a sense of persecution in the subject. But if, as I've noted before, as Van Putin et al. Again, in their discussion of drug refusal and schizophrenia assert, a gratifying relationship with a skilled clinician appears to be the only means of getting certain patients to take their medication, this dimension isn't something we should ignore. The anxieties we find emerging in response to the question of the desire of the other can be seen to be supported and at times exceeded by the extent of the uncertainty, the not knowing how and why psychotropics work that we looked at in the first of these videos. Indeed, we could say that this uncertainty is generative not simply of anxiety or sense of persecution, but of paranoia in its true sense. Persecution and paranoia aren't simply the same thing. The distinction is an important one clinically, so that no matter how perspicacious and important they might be, critiques of psychotropic medications necessarily exhibit a strain of paranoia in their attempt to introduce their own second order of symbolization, of explanation and knowledge when confronted with this unknown and the claims made by biological psychiatry. This is paranoia. And yes, this can take on a directly persecutory air when the mendacity and greed of pharmaceutical companies is evoked. And in speaking of anxiety, we shouldn't ignore a further dimension to the terms in which this might circulate, namely the ways in which the medicated subject might produce dis-ease, not simply in themselves, but in others. Others who find themselves confronted with the double of a subject they thought they knew, that they presumed they were familiar with, but who now appears at once familiar but unfamiliar, the uncanny effects of which we can say only contribute to the unease and suspicion around medications. And yet, we can also point to how, for the patient subject, the prescriber can inhabit another, or actually further, let me put it like that for the moment, position, one that, as we looked at in the second and third of these videos, situates the prescriber in relation to the father as function, as paternal function. It isn't the case that we have to find a simple either-or relation at play here, though, either the prescriber as other or the prescriber as existing in relation to the father as function. Rather, we can say that for those subjects for whom the paternal function operates in its imaginary or symbolic guises, it will serve to frame, to govern the prescriber's status as other. As we saw in the previous videos, conceived of in relation to the paternal function, we find the prescriber as the one who, through the act of telling, instructing, authorising the subject to take a medication, serving to engender the castrative effects we've seen psychotropics can produce. In those instances where, as in the schizophrenias, the paternal function doesn't operate, we find the father existing hors la loi. In paranoia and melancholia, we find the paternal function in its imaginary guise at play. We can position these differing configurations of the prescriber's relation to the paternal function, or indeed its absence, as contributing to the anxiety and unease we find associated with psychotropic medications. Where the paternal function is at play, this may take the form of the castrative effects associated with the imaginary and symbolic fathers and their related functions, but concomitantly, the presence of the paternal function can serve to reduce the anxieties associated with the prescriber as other I've just outlined, as well as the subject's sense of being consumed by the other, the presence of the law in its maternal guise, and the anxieties associated with this. And yet, where the paternal function is absent, what we may also find is the presence of the father, hors la loi, at play in the subject's transference to the prescriber and in the unease surrounding medications. This can take any number of forms and can produce any number of effects that reach beyond the comparably defined and, dare I say, predictable anxieties associated with the paternal function in its twin guises. This can include a sense of the aggressivity, of the domination and unmediated rivalry we can, it's by no means unusual, find associated with the father hors la loi, and the terms in which these threats can emerge, be construed, manifest in diverse forms at the level of the real. All of which, not only the designation antipsychotics, but the effects these medications produce can, we could say, appear to collude with. The sense in which the prescriber as other might invoke the dimension of the maternal raises what might seem to be a significant question. How can we, let me put it like this, speak of the paternal when medication is something that is typically, so often, orally ingested? Surely it's quite clear that this would place this relation as mediated by the breast on the side of the maternal. Whether in regard to this we feel the need to invoke notions or fantasies of the breast as the first object that heals, that sates the infant's hunger and the pain this can bring, we'd have to contend with the discussion developed in the 13th of March 1968 lesson of Seminar 15, that the breast constitutes the original, although Lacan invokes the placenta as prefiguring the breast here, original or primary then, objet are, that beyond any capacity to unite the infant and the mother, will constitute the first source of this subject's division. And as Freud will discuss in his negation essay of 1925, expressed in the language of the oldest, the oral drive impulses, Triebregung, the notion of what is bad, what is alien to the ego, and what is external are, to begin with, identical, an idea he broached 10 years earlier in Drives and Their Vicissitudes, and would take up in Civilizations and Its Discontents, and an idea that, if we accept it, provides a contextual underpinning for the terms in which medication's position as external to the subject is fundamental to the dis-ease surrounding them. And yet, the very idea of there being an affinity between the breast and medication is something we might well want to question. In one sense, it's difficult to envisage how the act of taking medication can be configured as a source of oral satisfaction, be it in regard to the sating of hunger or thirst, or as the source of what in Seminar 11 is identified as the more significant aim, the pleasure of the mouth, including what's located in the previous seminar as the acme of this pleasure, the act of sucking, but which encompasses more than this, including the biting of the nipple, also referenced there. Rather, beyond the sense of medication constituting a source of oral satisfaction, the act of taking medication occurs in terms that are highly regulated, being prescribed, ordered, restricted, written down, including when and how much is to be taken, and being subject to legal restrictions to quite overtly the law, and entailing the introduction of a third. The prescriber isn't typically the one who will give the patient the medication each time they're to take it, all of which we can locate as invoking the regulatory, restrictive, ordering dimensions of the father, in regard to which it's worth noting the letters and numbers that appear on pills, inscriptions which serve to assert the presence of the symbolic and its ordering regulatory function, right there inscribed into the medication, forming a hollow, if you like, in the hard reel. To conclude then, these inscriptions point us towards something else as well, something I haven't mentioned but which circulates throughout everything I've been speaking about here. The question of the psychoactive effects of language, the symbolic, and the terms in which it can itself be said to constitute a psychoactive substance. Something I invoked last time in the previous video in regard to Plutarch's conception of philosophia as pharmakon. Isn't it the case that it's via the psychoactive capacity and effects of the symbolic in the form of speech that psychoanalysis principally operates to bring about change in the subject? It's hard to argue otherwise, isn't it? Although whether we can really speak of the symbolic at work here to sol is questionable, as we're reminded in the final lesson of Seminar 20, one of Lacan's greatest lessons, in the emphasis placed upon the corporality, the materiality of speech there. Speech is something more than the symbolic per se. On the back of which I could attempt to make some claim like psychoanalysis also produces a medicated subject just as much as biological psychiatry does. It's just that they're medicated by speech, by the symbolic, and it's not to sell guys, which I'm not going to do. Rather, I want to end by suggesting that if the medicated subject is a fraud, they're a fraud who reveals that the symbolic has failed at some level. Failed to be inscribed, configured, and operate in a way that would allow the subject to get by without recourse to another substance, without recourse to medication. As we're going to ask in the final video of this series, can we relate the growth in the use of psychotropic medications over recent decades to a denuding of the capacity and potency of the symbolic? This is a question that isn't unrelated to the status of the father. But that's after we take a detour, a necessary detour, in the next video into a dream, the foundational dream of psychoanalysis, the solution of which has remained an enigma for a long time. If you liked this video, click on like and subscribe to the channel.